We really are going to show the world that the story of carbohydrates and exercise is utterly wrong. If you designed the system that became limited by energy provision, people would run out of energy and the muscles would go into rigor and you'd be dead. And that never happens. For those who are eating high carb diets, if they're not exercising, they're in real trouble. There are these two pools, and one is critical for exercise performance and one is totally unimportant. And the totally unimportant one is...
With us today, we have the wonderful, very impressive Professor Tim Noakes, who is not only a medical doctor, but a sports scientist, one of the leading sports scientists in the world. Professor Noakes is the founder and director of the Noakes Foundation and the founder and medical director of the Nutrition Network and the co-founder of Eat Better South Africa. I know you were one of the people that helped to bring the Banting diet to South Africa. You've been a low-carb advocate. And recently, maybe you don't know this, maybe you do, you've been named as one of the top 20 misinfluencer in the world by the Eat Lancet Foundation. I join you on that list, so it's a dubious honor, I suppose, that we're on there. And I think we're in pretty good company. So anyway, Professor Noakes, how are you today? How are things in South Africa? By the way, I assume you're still down there, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And don't you have a South African connection? Your mother, I think, is from South Africa.
My mother is a Benonian. I don't know if that's the right word, but she was born in Benoni and lived there. And I'd been there many, many times. The last time I was there was 92. So it's been a long time since I last been in South Africa. But and this is a thing that one of the things I do remember was the first time I had biltong was there. My grandmother gave it to me, and I was like, "What is this stuff? This is incredible!" And so it's funny that now years later, I love this stuff. It is probably one of the best ways to consume meat on the go. I'm sure you probably agree with that.
Absolutely, I absolutely live on it. Yeah. So now I'm very well, thank you. I'm aging. I'm now 76, and I still feel like I'm 50. And it's difficult to believe that when I think of myself, I don't think of that I'm over 70.
Yeah.
But I'm doing very well indeed. I've had a very good week. We've had 3 papers accepted or published this week, which is a record for me. So I've been in science for 40 odd years, and this had never happened before. So I've been so fortunate that when I went through my trial and then started researching again, was invited to research with Professor Philip Prince in Pennsylvania. And we never knew where it would lead. And it's just unbelievable what the work we've been able to do in the last 10 years has been absolutely stunning. And we really are going to show the world that the story of carbohydrates and exercise is utterly wrong, as I know you frequently show when you're with your own experiences and performances. But it's utterly wrong. And we were the first people who was brave enough to test it in 40 years. Everyone else just accepted that the story that carbohydrates are essential. So we said, well, why don't we try and disprove that? And we did, and we proved it fantastically.
Let's just put some background into this for the people that may not be familiar with this particular topic. Back in the late 1960s, I think the Scandinavians came up with this concept of glycogen loading. And that was sort of the accepted dogma. And it's been dogma for the last, as you mentioned, 50, 60 years. The thought is you would just eat a bunch of pasta the night before or a couple of days before you perform. And, that's the belief is it's all based on muscle glycogen. And I've interviewed Professor Prims and Andrew Kutnick. I know he was on a paper with you guys recently. Yes, and we're talking about that maybe glycogen isn't the whole story. So maybe we could talk about, and I know you're a sports scientist, you've talked about the central governor theory, we've talked about issues around hydration or overhydration, but what is the performance glucose glycogen story as you believe it to be now?
Okay, it's quite simple that carbohydrates in the body form into 2 pools. They are 2 separately regulated pools. And if people are listening, I don't think I probably have ever heard that before. And I certainly didn't realize that until about a year ago. So I was writing with Andrew this very long paper, and that's just been accepted for publication. And it's the one that gives 16 reasons, 16 evidence in 100 pages of text 16 reasons why it's not muscle glycogen that is limiting exercise performance. So what we've been able to show is that there are these two pools, and one is critical for exercise performance and one is totally unimportant. And the totally unimportant one is the muscle glycogen stores. They're completely irrelevant for human exercise performance. And we showed that by having people exercise when they had loaded their muscles full of carbohydrate or when they'd gone on our diet and had very low muscle glycogen. Their performance was identical. And there are at least 10 to 15 other properly conducted studies showing there's zero benefit in loading up your muscles with glycogen in the weeks before exercise. Zero. And so when you look at all the evidence, it's absolutely clear, but for some reason it doesn't get through. So that's the first thing. Now, the second pool is in the liver and the bloodstream, and that is critical because that's what keeps your blood glucose normal. And what we show is that once your blood glucose starts to fall, your brain says there's a problem. We've got to slow you down. And so you start to get the sensations of fatigue and you find it difficult to continue. But if you replace the glucose in the bloodstream, you can continue to exercise like that. And we show that that's got nothing to do with metabolism in the whole body. It's just keeping the blood glucose level up. So that's the story. And we've got another fantastic, iconic, brilliant study. Because you referred to that iconic Scandinavian study where they did muscle biopsies. We've got a better study in which we've looked at marathon runners over 2 years, running the same marathon, either with carbs, either with carbo loading or not carbo loading. In other words, when they were on a high carbohydrate diet for months leading to the race, and when they were on a high fat diet for months leading into the race. And that will answer the question and show what the truth is.
So I have all kinds of questions I can come at this. One, so what is the purpose of muscle glycogen, and does it not contribute in any way, shape, or form to the intravascular glucose pool? I'm just wondering what is the point of muscle glycogen in the first place? Where does it go? Why is it there? Is it beneficial in any way?
Okay, it's only detrimental.
That's interesting. That's a big statement.
It's there for a very simple reason, and you will know this, but you haven't been told it or hadn't thought about it. It's there to protect the blood glucose. So what I didn't realize also until the last year or so is that humans can only metabolize a certain amount of carbohydrate. There's an upper limit, and it's 250 grams. That's it. Because if you take a human and you give them 250 grams, that will be all they can cope with. If you give them 300 grams, they've got 50 grams excess, and they have to do something with it. And what's happened across the world is that now people are living on 300, 350 grams a day, and they can cope for a period, but then the system breaks down. So one of the ways you cope with 300 grams versus 250 is you just stuff it into your muscles. And that's what the muscle glycogen store is there for. It's to take the overload of glucose from the bloodstream when you're eating a high carbohydrate diet. So that's the evidence for that is, well, I can give you some of it. But the reason why the next question is, why do you burn carbohydrate first? If your muscles are full of glycogen, why do you burn carbohydrate first? So we did a study in the 1990s where we measured what people were burning at rest. And now if carbohydrate is the jet fuel, you wouldn't burn it at rest. You'll burn something less effective like fat. And we showed that the people who burnt a lot of fat at rest were the ones eating the high carbohydrate diet, who had plenty of glycogen in their muscles, and they tended to be more likely to be insulin resistant. So that's the story. It's if you've got a lot of carbohydrate on board, you burn it first and you get rid of it as quickly as possible. Why is that? Only reason I can think is because the body says, oh my gosh, you idiot, you're going to eat more carbohydrate. I must get rid of all this carbohydrate. So that's the first sign. But now, why did I say it's dangerous? Also, experiments we did in 1998. And again, we didn't realize what we were doing. We were trying to explain why can't you exercise when you got on a low carbohydrate diet? So we had people who were muscle glycogen depleted, and then we infused glucose into their bloodstreams. And guess what? Nothing happened. They wouldn't burn it. They just continued to burn fat. And we showed that the single most important determinant of how much fat you're burning was the muscle glycogen content. So what muscle glycogen does is it regulates your metabolic response during exercise and at rest. So if your muscles are perpetually filled with glycogen, as most of us are, if we're not exercising, most people living in Western countries not exercising, their muscle glycogen is full all the time. That pushes their insulin up, and that means they will burn carbohydrate, not fat. Now they take in more carbohydrate, again, over the excess of 250 grams, and they've got to convert it into fat. And that's where you get the visceral fat, which then drives the insulin resistance. So to answer your question, my opinion is that muscle glycogen is an adaptation in humans because remember, as you know, we were mainly carnivores. We came up as carnivores, so we didn't need muscle glycogen. But somewhere along the way, when we started eating carbohydrates, we used this as an escape route. So we'd dump the extra carbohydrate in the muscles, and then we'd burn it as soon as we possibly could. And we stupid scientists like myself said, oh, you see, the athletes are burning carbohydrates. That's because that's the jet fuel. And we were totally wrong. The body's trying to get rid of that fuel.
Interesting. Very interesting. Very controversial. I'm sure a lot of people will be up in arms when they hear this coming out.
Absolutely will.
Let me ask you, so blood glucose is going to fall probably when liver glycogen is depleted then. Is that a fair statement? Because the liver is pretty good at dumping glycogen or breaking down its glycogen and turning it into glucose. Is that an accurate statement? Hey folks, it's Dr. ShawnBaker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly.
Yeah. So, and now you see, this is the real interesting thing, because now if we go back to 1986, we were trying to show that carbohydrates make you perform better. And we made one error. We didn't fast the people before exercise. And so when we did an experiment, let's say it lasted 3 hours, if you start an exercise for 3 hours and you've eaten carbohydrates before and you've kept the liver full, you probably will get through that 3 hours without becoming hypoglycemic. But Ed Coyle in Texas, University of Austin in Texas, was clever enough to realize that if he fasted the athletes for 16 hours before, they would become hypoglycemic within 3 hours of his experiment. Most people, it's difficult to get people to exercise for more than 3 hours in the laboratory. And he then showed that they would become hypoglycemic. And if they gave them carbohydrates, they would last longer. They would be able to do the full 3 hours. In fact, they went 4 hours of exercise. So you're quite correct. If you don't have carbohydrates before exercise or during exercise, you become hypoglycemic. And then your performance drops off. Now, with this paper that we wrote with Andy Kutnick recently, I was the first person, and I went through all the studies of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise. And I was the first person to look and see, okay, what happened in the control group? No one worries about the control group. They look at the group who have taken the carbohydrate, but they ignore the control group. And I checked how many people became hypoglycemic in the control group. And we were able to show that in 88% of the studies showing a beneficial effect of carbohydrate ingestion, the control group had developed hypoglycemia. If the control group didn't develop hypoglycemia, there was little or no benefit of carbohydrate ingestion. And so we were the first person to point that out. Because no one was worrying about hypoglycemia. Of course, it's muscle glycogen. So that's one of the biggest evidence that if you want to prove that carbohydrates work in the laboratory, you have to design the experiment so that the control group develops hypoglycemia. Then you'll get a result. And the consequence of that is that the only things that will improve your athletic performance ingested during exercise are things that prevent hypoglycemia. If they don't prevent hypoglycemia, they're not going to make a difference. That there may be one or two minor corrections on that, but that's the most important point. So I can predict by looking at a study whether the carbohydrates worked in that study. You just look at the control group. If the control group became hypoglycemic, carbohydrate ingestion before or during exercise will improve their performance. If there's no difference in the blood glucose level, you probably won't find an effect.
That's interesting, and I will sort of show you an example of that very exciting thing. This morning at 6 a.m. I was out on the track running sprints because I have to be there before the school opens. It's the only time I can get on there. It's cold, wet, rainy. I didn't eat dinner last night. I've been training pretty hard the last couple of days. I was undoubtedly probably depleted in glycogen in my liver, and I ran out there and I felt a little low and I ran slower. And then I looked at I was wearing a CGM. Blood glucose below 55. Went home and checked it. I was 43, and my time was down about 10%. And I usually do well at about 60. I'm fine at 60. Once I get below 50, I'm a little symptomatic. And what I guess when you define hypoglycemia, I mean, it's obviously relative for what they're used to, because some people can walk around at 60 and be fine, where others, if they're below 100, if they're diabetic, they may be really, really problematic. But I guess most athletes, the number is going to be, I don't know if you had a 60 or 70 as a cutoff, I would imagine, for hypoglycemia. But I mean, I absolutely felt it. I mean, my performance was down easily 10%. I was looking at my times, I'm timing everything. I'm like, I'm slow and I don't feel quite as good. And I looked and yep, sure enough, my blood glucose is low. So absolutely confirmed.
Actually, we define hypoglycemia as a falling blood glucose. That's if your blood glucose falls during exercise, that's enough to impair your performance. And you're fortunate because you're ketotic, so you've got a bit of reserve. You can go to a lower glucose.
Right.
And before your performance starts to fall, because the brain's not as concerned. It's got another fuel source that it can use. And also lactate. When you're doing your sprints, you've got a bit of lactate as well. So the brain's partially protected because of the lactate and the ketones.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because I've hit world-class numbers on the rowing machine with blood glucose in the 60s, no problem. I've looked at it and I'm like, okay, I'm performing well, even though but once I get much lower than that, then I start to feel it. With regard to exercise, obviously there's different types of exercise. I mean, there's the very short sprint, creatine phosphate, ATP dominant stuff. There's a anaerobic glycolysis, and then we get into the oxidative stuff. Where does this matter, or does it matter all across the board?
No. What's also interesting, so I'm rewriting my book, Law of Running, the 5th edition. And I discover all these people who I'd forgotten about or hadn't made it into the sort of, hadn't become popular and accepted, or their work hadn't become accepted. And one of them is a guy called Peter Weyand. And Peter Weyand grew up in Boston, and he studied big animals in Africa, big African animals. And they studied, I think it was Dick Taylor was the professor there. And they wanted to work out what's the energy cost of running. And so they used all these big animals. And eventually he moved on. And he did one experiment that you never hear about in the sports sciences. He developed a technique for measuring very, very short duration exercise, lasting about 3 seconds, 3 to 8 seconds. And he wanted to compare cyclists. We wanted to look at runners and people, the same person, when they were running or cycling. Now, it's very obvious. If it's an energy problem, it doesn't matter whether you run or you cycle, you're going to produce the same amount of power, because the power is limiting. The energy provision is limiting. The power output must be the same. He found the cyclists, when they cycle, the same people produced 1.5 times more power when they cycled than when they ran for 8 seconds. And the only explanation is that the power comes from the foot up, not down. In other words, it's not an energy provision problem. The problem is how much power can you generate while your foot's on the ground? And your foot's on the ground when you're pedaling because you can pedal faster than you can run. Your foot's on the ground, as it were, for a longer period, so you can generate more force. And no one ever mentions that story. So the point is that energy provision does not limit performance at all. It never did, and it never would. And with respect, if you were the creator, you wouldn't design a system like that. Because if you designed the system that became limited by energy provision, people would run out of energy and the muscles would go into rigor and you'd be dead. And that never happens. So the system is differently controlled. And you're quite right, you go through glycolysis. And what their work is showing is that glycolysis is a disaster. So if you use more glycolysis to produce your power, then your power falls up quite quickly. Now, it's really interesting being an African. Now, one of my great students looked at cheetahs and lions. And cheetahs and lions have one characteristic. They're very fast and very powerful, but they can only go a short distance. And so they have to, when they hunt, they have to ambush because they can't get out there and just chase the animal. The buck are trained, or the antelope have got different muscle fibers, and they can last for longer. And what he shows is that there's a specific muscle type, fiber type that's present in lions and cheetahs. And that gives them this huge power output. So they can go very, very fast, but for a very short time because they turn on glycolysis. And that glycolysis ultimately causes the muscle to start fatiguing. So in my opinion, the control of exercise is from the brain, but the muscle type that you have is critically important. And Usain Bolt runs fast not because he produces more ATP, etc. He does, but it's because he's got muscles that can produce much more force. And that keeps him the foot's on the ground for such a short time. In that short time, he can propel himself a couple of meters. And that's what makes high performances. It's the type of muscle fibers that you have that make the huge difference. So I just mentioned that because the old idea that you run out of fuel, that doesn't exist. And again, it doesn't exist when you're running the marathon. You don't run out of glycogen. There are other reasons why you become tired.
When you guys were assessing, when you're doing your recent studies, are you doing muscle biopsies as well? I know there's ultrasounds for glycogen. Yeah. I'm not sure how accurate those are, but how do you assess the glycogen status?
Yeah, that's one of the weaknesses of the study. We didn't because we did so much else. And it was done in a college where they don't do muscle biopsies. We didn't do muscle biopsies, and that's the one weakness. So the people say, you see, they just started with low muscle glycogen. They had a full muscle glycogen. But if you look at the literature, there's one study suggesting that some people had normal glycogens when they were eating the low carbohydrate diet. We didn't find it when we did our studies here. And in any case, those people are the ones who promote high carbohydrate diets. Why? To raise muscle glycogen. So if muscle glycogen can go up on a low carbohydrate diet, why are you guys promoting a high carbohydrate diet? The logic is not there. There's no reason to suspect that you can store lots of glycogen on a low carbohydrate diet. It's only been documented by Jeff Volek, and he looked at very, very experienced runners. And I reviewed that paper and I couldn't agree with him. I said, I don't agree with this for various reasons, and made calculations and showed that there was a whole lot of energy which was disappearing somewhere. In other words, if you're using that much glycogen during exercise in a low carb state and all that much fat, there's an excess of energy that you can't account for. And he explained it another way, but he might be right, he might be wrong. So I think that if you could have normal muscle glycogen from a low carbohydrate diet, then we don't have to promote a high carbohydrate diet. So let's stop talking about it anyway. Let's stop advocating high carbohydrate diets.
But if you're saying that a low carbohydrate also repletes our glycogen in our muscles, and at the same time you're saying that's actually detrimental, then perhaps that's sort of a contradiction, I suppose. And
Yeah,
your position is
sorry.
it doesn't promote glycogen
Yeah,
storage.
sorry, exactly. And we know it doesn't, because in our studies they had a high fat oxidation, very high fat oxidation. And you can't have a high fat oxidation if you've got normal muscle glycogen. You have to have low muscle glycogen.
Let me go
So
back to
that's, yeah,
let me go back to the liver for a second, Professor Noakes, if you
sure.
don't mind, because obviously that seems to be the performance based on the data you're collecting now, that the liver glycogen and ultimately the blood glucose is where it's at. And so like the other day, I broke another American record on the rowing machine quite easily, by the way. I was quite surprised how easy it was. And I had eaten zero. I mean, I'd straight 100% beef diet for, I think it was 32 days into a pure beef diet when I did that. And so obviously, I mean, I would assume that my liver glycogen is relatively replete, probably due to lactate recycling or, gluconeogenesis via the protein I'm consuming. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, indeed. And but also, you're not going to become hypoglycemic in what you're doing. You're doing these high explosive, short 2-minute bouts, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. They're sprints. They're 100 meter,
Yeah.
they're 500 meter, 1 minute, 100 meter. Everything's under a minute and a half generally.
And you're so adapted. I've got a friend who eats no carbs and cycles 100 kilometers a day, and he has not eaten carbs for a long time, and he never becomes hypoglycemic. So I think what you're doing is you're turning fat into glucose somewhere, and it may be in the liver or it may be in the adipose tissue or somewhere. But I think there has to be another mechanism, and that's logical. If humans evolved eating high-fat diets, sooner or later, those ones who could turn fat into glucose would be beneficial for them, and more and quicker than the gluconeogenesis. Because if you look at the data for all the studies, our gluconeogenic rates are the same. It doesn't matter what you're eating; they actually don't increase much with a a high fat diet. So something else is happening. There's some other process that's preventing hypoglycemia in you and in my friend who does all the cycling without ever eating any carbs. And
Yeah,
always in which fat can be converted to glucose outside of gluconeogenesis in the liver.
let me just kind of shift gears a little bit, because I want to touch on this because you wrote the book Waterlog, and you were talking about how people were pushing all this water on athletes, and some of them were becoming hyponatremic, brain swelling, issues like that. What is your thought on hydrating while consuming electrolyte at the same time? Because that would seem to mitigate that hyponatremia that's occurring. And my understanding is when athletes are dehydrated, and again, this is the other end of the spectrum, their performance
Yeah.
falls. They dehydrate 2%, they see a significant reduction in there. So you have to maintain a level of hydration, but you don't want to be diluted. So how do we approach hydration?
Okay, so we looked at that question about the 2%, and it depends how you define the 2%. If it's a 2% weight loss, then you're not 2% dehydrated.
Mm-hmm.
So we found that you probably weren't at all dehydrated at a 2% weight loss, because you've lost weight, you've lost glycogen, you've lost other water. The body probably has an excess of water in the gut. And the first thing you do as you become dehydrated is you put that water into the cells. And so it actually is quite difficult to become dehydrated. That's the first point. But you're quite correct. There is some evidence that if you do lose weight during exercise, your performance goes down. We've always said you should drink to thirst, and most studies show that that's adequate, but not all studies. So I agree with you. There may be some role for making sure you don't lose too much weight during exercise. On the other hand, if you're running a marathon, it's a huge benefit to lose 5 kilograms weight, as runners have done setting world records, and they run the last.
They can negative split when they come in 5 pounds lighter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Haile Gebrselassie, we measured him, or I shouldn't say we, but colleagues measured. He lost 5 kilograms setting the world record in Berlin some years ago. And so and that was 10% of his body weight, because he only weighs 50 kilograms. So I've always been arguing that dehydration really doesn't make too much difference. But however, I quite accept there are some studies suggesting that it's better to stay properly hydrated. But now let's just talk about hyponatremia.
Okay.
And the answer is you can't lose enough sodium to drop your blood sodium concentration. The sweat, when you sweat, the sodium in your sweat, you're actually trying to get rid of that sweat because it's the salt, it's the excess salt you took in the day before. And how do we know all this? Because of Jerome Kohn at the University of Michigan and in the Second World War. He was looking at uh, conscientious objectors. He was given the right to use the group of conscientious objectors in any way he liked, because the American forces were fighting in the Pacific, and it was very hot, and they wanted to know what's going to help their guys fighting in the heat. And for some reason, the US military decided it was going to be electrolytes and sodium balance. So they went and looked at the guy who was the world authority, or the American authority, and they discovered Jerome Kohn. So what he did was he took these religious people, these conspirators, didn't want to fight in the war, and he made them exercise for 6 hours a day in the heat. Can you imagine that? Getting up in the heat, exercising 6 hours, and knowing you have to repeat it the next day. And over a period of months, he reduced their sodium intake and eventually got down to very low intakes, like 1 gram a day. And they still were able to manage their sodium balance. And what they did was they just stopped excreting sodium in sweat and urine. And they retained all the sodium that they were getting in the diet. And other studies have tried to make people sodium deficient, and it's almost impossible, because there's such a drive to take in sodium that you will find the sodium somewhere and you'll add the salt to your diet. So that's the first thing. It's very difficult to drop your sodium concentration by sweating out sodium. What happens is you have to expand your blood volume and the extracellular fluid space. And that's a bit easier to do. And the people who really do it are the ones who have the syndrome, which you know about, syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. Mm-hmm. And those are the people who overdrink, because they drink during exercise, they don't pass urine, and so they think I'm dehydrated. And they're not passing urine because they're secreting antidiuretic hormone. And so then they've been told to drink as much as tolerable. So they continue to overdrink, and they retain that fluid. And then what happens is they come in semi-conscious, and the doctors diagnose dehydration and give them fluid, and that's enough to kill them. So that's where the problems arise.
Let me ask you about, you said that, muscle glycogen may actually in fact be a detriment. And one of the things that I have seen personally, I have verified this over and over, and particularly in folks that are a little bit older, that have a little bit of mileage on them, that when they consume high carbohydrates, sugary food, grains, it often leads to inflammation, and particularly in the joints, which would be obviously negative for performance. One of the reasons I feel that I'm able to perform at a high level as I'm about to turn 60 is because my joints don't hurt. And I think that as an older athlete clearly is beneficial when you don't have pain. So that you can train consistently. Do you think that outside of the muscle glycogen being an issue, do you see carbs as a perhaps performance detriment in some form or fashion under that sort of, kind of scenario where maybe it leads to increased inflammation? It might, because, again, we're talking about, maybe someone in their 20s versus someone in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, which I think are two different animals, so to speak. Thoughts on that concept?
I absolutely agree with you. And, we are researching players in contact sports, and the results, when you put them on the carnivore diet, are stupendous, because they stop getting that inflammation and they get fewer injuries, fewer soft tissue injuries, and they can perform better. So, and these are youngsters, they're below 30. And so, if you look at the South African rugby team, you'll see that.
Is this a trick for the South African rugby team?
Well, I don't actually consult with them, but I think if you look at that team, you will find that they've got thinner, so they've got less fat, less subcutaneous fat over the years, and more muscle. And that's, I think, has to be a big advantage. But now let's look at the problem with muscle glycogen. One of the weaknesses of the carbohydrate insulin model is that it focuses only on what happens when you take carbohydrates and your insulin rises and your insulin rises. And then the focus is purely on that. But what is also happening is that these people have muscle glycogen that is elevated all the time, and that keeps the insulin high. And so they are going to be storing fat, visceral fat, all the time. Any excess carbohydrate is going to be going to visceral fat, and the visceral fat is what's driving the inflammation. So that's where I think the missing link in the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity is that it only looks at what acutely happens when you take in carbohydrates. It doesn't look or include what's happening for people who are always have their muscle glycogen full because they're eating high carbs and they're not exercising. And I think that's what's happening, is that in your case, your muscle glycogen always low and you've got no carbs in the diet, so you've got no reason to produce visceral fat and ectopic fat. So you've got no reason to be inflamed. But for those who are eating high carb diets, if they're not exercising, they're in real trouble. And I think of myself. So I was profoundly insulin resistant, measured in when I was 28 years old. I only realized it years later because we'd done some experiments on low carb and high carb diets. Would you believe it? We were studying ketosis. If you look at one of the earliest studies of ketosis in athletes, you'll see we wrote it in 1980 in the Journal of Physiology. And I was one of the subjects. And so I get this huge ketosis on a low carb diet, but fantastic. But what we didn't look at was what was my insulin level and what was my glucose levels when I was eating a high carb diet. And my insulin was threefold normal. It was up in the 30s, which is frightening. So I always had the insulin resistance. And so I discovered that if I ran the Comrades Marathon, which was 90 kilometers, and trained 100 miles a week, I didn't get fat. But the instant I stopped running, I would explode a couple of kilos within weeks. And why? Because I had this high carb diet, I was insulin resistant, and I just converted all that excess into de novo lipogenesis. And I could see it as subcutaneous fat, but I was also getting visceral fat, I'm sure was also increasing. And then I was getting inflamed, etc. And the only cure for me was to run 100 miles a week. And of course, the real cure was don't eat those carbs, you stupid person.
You'd mentioned just briefly a moment ago that you said when you put young athletes on a carnivore diet, their performance increases. Do you feel that some of the, I think we talked years ago and we talked about a guy, I believe his name was Art Shrub or something like that. He was a turn of the 20th century, just incredible running athlete, had world records in every distance from like 100 meters up to 10,000 meters or something like that. Ate primarily a meat diet. Do you feel that there are compounds in meat, perhaps even creatine? Creatine is obviously getting a lot of attention in the news lately as a supplement for cognitive issues and cardiac issues. But we know that obviously red meat in particular is full of creatine, and we have this creatine phosphate system, which provides a lot of that explosive, quick energy that we use. Do you feel that there's beneficial compounds? Is meat a performance enhancing substance, I suppose? I don't want to say drug, but.
Okay, so one of the great runners who set the world record, I must just get his name again, Jim Peters, British runner. And he was really interesting because he came just at the end of the Second World War. He was starting to get good. And he competed in the 1948 Olympics. And at that time, Britain was being rationed. And he said that all of a sudden, I know what happened. They were getting food was given to them in preparation for the 1948 Olympics because everyone felt sorry for Britain and the British athletes that they provided them with meat. So the athletes could train with meat. By 1952, when he was now a world record holder or about to become a world record holder, he said, I had to train on potatoes and rice. And he said it wasn't the same as on meat. And this is a guy who dropped the world marathon record by about 6 minutes over a period of 3 or 4 years. But he'd grown up eating meat because that's what the British do. And then along came the war and there was rationing. And so he was one of the first people who suffered as a result of, well, sorry, he suffered as a result of the rationing. And he realized that he couldn't train as well on a diet that didn't include as much meat as he'd usually eaten. So do I think meat? I mean, I think you're a great example of something good happens when you eat meat.
Yeah, like I said, it's interesting, because I'm very conscious of my performance over time. I'm very, I measure a lot of things, and I have in the last decade, I have not lost anything. As far as like I can get on the rowing machine, hit the same numbers at soon to be 59 as I could at 50, and so again, it's not 70, but it's still aging without losing performance, which I think is interesting. I think is an interesting phenomenon, and I think it probably, when we look at competitive athletes, if they want to extend their career, I guess maybe this concept, and I know you guys touched on it in a recent paper, talking about minimum effective dose of carbohydrates. You said if it's blood glucose, and maybe you don't need 60, 70, 80 grams per hour. Maybe it's something like 10 or something like that. What are your thoughts on the concept of minimum effective dose for carbohydrates for performance? And when do you need to do that?
Yeah, well, if you're going to exercise for more than 2 hours, you need 10 grams an hour. That's all. That's it during exercise. And I can tell you with certainty, because that was the one study we did. We're doing another study in which we're looking at higher doses. And no one bothered to do that, except for one study which came from the industry. And when it's industry funded and the two first authors are employed by the industry, you have to be dubious. And that's the only study looking at a dose response effect of increased carbohydrate intake during exercise. They supposedly claimed there was a dose response effect. But when you looked at the data, if I'd written that article, it would have got thrown out because it's got no data. It's just got a few graphs. But they didn't bother to put the data in. So you can't judge whether this is nonsense or not. But it got published because that's peer review. It supports those who continue to say the same thing. But we're currently doing a study with it, seeing what happens with increasing doses, and the results will be out, I would guess, in 6 months or so, and then we'll be able to see, does an increasing dose make you do better during exercise? And at the moment, the evidence is no, and we'll have the answer with all those data in due course.
So now you mentioned 2 hours. Now, most athletic activities are well below that. I mean, probably 98% of sports do not last 2 hours. I mean, there's, obviously the Olympic marathon distance, that's the world record is essentially 2 hours exactly. And, but, 100 meters, the 5K, the 10K, the hurdles, the high jump, the pole vault, the shot put, Olympic lifting, rugby, a rugby match is under 2 hours. A soccer match is under 2 hours. So, I mean, basically for almost all but a very tiny percentage of sports, carbohydrates are completely unnecessary. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely correct. Yeah. And again, we're trying to say they might be detrimental if you're eating them all the time for the reasons that we've spoken about. Yeah, I watch quite a few sports, and the one sport that really concerns me is women's tennis. I mean, these girls are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then you see them, as soon as there's a break, every 3 games, they open and then they get the squeezy or the chocolate or something. I mean, this is just food, just sugar addiction. You can't be at your best at some of the weights that those girls are carrying. And no one's suggesting that there's a better way. And then, of course, they're getting injured as well. So,
well,
I just don't understand why we have to keep going with this carbohydrates as being so important for exercise when the evidence is clear that they're not.
Well, interesting you point that out, because recently, you remember Serena Williams, obviously world champion, multi-time Grand Slam, whatever, won all the different tournaments. She is now a sponsor, I guess, a celebrity endorser for Ozempic, because she says she had to go on that drug to lose like 30 or 40 pounds that she'd put on after her tennis career ended. So probably the same exact thing, as you mentioned, you need to run 100 miles a week to keep the fat off. And as soon as she stopped playing tennis at a high level, she ballooned up and now has to take these drugs to keep her keep her weight in line. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly clearly a problem for
Yeah. I
anybody.
mean, what amazes, she's a multimillionaires and obviously a highly intelligent woman. And why don't they see it? Because the sugar addiction is so powerful. And it's much easier to take the injection rather than face your own sugar addiction issues.
Let me, and I'm sure you're familiar. I know you did a little rowing back in the day. You're familiar with, Steve Redgrave, who was,
Yes.
I think,
Yeah.
five-time Olympic gold medalist, became a type 2 diabetic. And we are seeing now athletic studies where athletes are wearing CGMs, and we're seeing some of these athletes, even high-level, lean, fit athletes, seeing blood glucoses that are astronomically high. I've seen triathlon. I think I've seen slides of triathlon guys where their blood glucose was 300, 400 milligrams per deciliter while they're in the midst of their event. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean it's going to happen, and in fact, in one of the studies we did with Andy and Philip, showed that 30%. There were 3 of 10 athletes were pre-diabetic, and when they went on the high-fat diet, they completely reversed their pre-diabetes, and they didn't lose weight. They didn't lose 1 kilogram of weight. They didn't change their diets. Sorry, they didn't change their calorie intake, and they didn't change their exercise. All they did was reduce the carbohydrate content of the diet. And immediately, and what happened? Their visceral fat got less, I would guess, and the liver cleared itself out of too much visceral fat, and they were fine. And that's the reality. So my attention was drawn to another great runner, a guy called Don Ritchie, who was a Scottish ultramarathon runner, held many world records. He was active when I was running, and he was considered the greatest ultra distance runner of the century. He died of coronary artery disease with diabetic ulcers. He eventually struggled to run because of a big ulcer on his foot. And that was the high carbohydrate diet. Here's a guy, the greatest ultra distance runner of the era. He used to run astronomical distances, still got his diabetes.
Yeah, that truly is a shame. So you mentioned, you guys have published 3 papers, got accepted to a journal just this week. What are you guys currently working on, or what sort of studies are you looking at these days?
Okay, so what's in the process at the moment is I was peripherally involved with a big study of marathon runners and the low carb versus the high carb diet in the same athletes, and that is done and dusted, and it's being written up now. So, and I think that we're going to have some very exciting results from that one. At the moment, Philip Prince and Kurtnik and his team are looking at the dose response effect of different amounts of carbohydrate during exercise. So they're going 0, 10, 60, and 90. And there should be a nice linear increase in performance with increasing intake. That's if the muscle glycogen story is true, because the muscle glycogen story is that when you do prolonged exercise, you run out of glycogen. The only way you can get the essential carbohydrate is from your diet, from what you're taking in. So if you're taking in 90 grams, you should be able to do better than 60, than 30, than 0. Or should I say 10? And those results will be out quite soon because the study's going extremely well. So those are the two major studies that are going to give some more definitive evidence for what we've talked about. I would really like to look at muscle glycogen and its role in the generation of diabetes. And I'm just working through ideas at the moment. I haven't yet finalized how one would study it. So, and the other one is the carbohydrate balance story. How can you, when you're young, balance a diet which is excess in carbohydrate, but when 20 or 30 years later, you can't anymore? And so what's changed? Because that's the change that follows the development of diabetes. And what we're doing at the moment is we're looking at diabetics and saying, well, this is what they are now. They're profoundly insulin resistant. They can't metabolize glucose. They can't oxidize it, et cetera, et cetera. their livers are producing too much glucose. How did they get there? What was the mechanism of getting there? And I think we will find it's purely a carbohydrate effect. And it's other people are saying that it could be seed oils and all these things. But the mechanism for excess glucose and excess fructose, that's very easy to explain how that would work. And we need to get, and I'll tell you why it's important, because one of the current studies, Professor Roy Taylor in Britain, he's got some great studies reversing type 2 diabetes, but he says it's a calorie excess that's the key. If you eat too many calories, you get type 2 diabetes. And so what his research did, they used a foodstuff that was generated by industry, and they used that to treat the patients because it was low calorie, etc. And the results are not as good as if you cut the carbohydrate, in my opinion. So he's absolutely right. The problem is this excess de novo lipogenesis in the liver and the pancreas, etc. But the cause is, the important is, it's not because there's too many calories per se, because you can't starve people, as we all know. If you put people on a 1,500 calorie diet, they go mad. That's as simple as that. And that was shown by Ansel Keys himself in the starvation studies at his university in the Second World War. And we don't want to go through those studies again. 1,500, if you have to eat 1,500 calories a day, you're going to starve yourself and you're not going to heal. But if you cut the carbs, if carbs are the drivers of the de novo lipogenesis, then all you do is focus on cutting the carbs, and that has a much better result. I'm fairly sure of that. So that's why I think it's important to isolate. It's not calories that are a problem. It's the carbohydrates that are the problem.
Let me go back to the performance stuff a little bit, because, and maybe your rebuttal to some of these things that people will say. They'll say that, but East Africans, particularly the Kenyans, they win all the marathons and their diet is high carb and they do very well. This doesn't seem to be detrimental to them. Thoughts on that? And then the other thing is, a lot of the studies on ketogenic athletes and diets, generally being short, 2-3 day studies, maybe up to 2 weeks. Performance are often neutral to negative. Is there an adaptation period that needs to be accounted for? How long is that period for an athlete? And does it depend on the sport? And then what about the East Africans?
Okay, so you've fallen for the greatest trick in medicine. It was a trick that Ansel Keys used. Countries with high saturated fat diets have more heart disease, coronary heart disease. That's association, does not prove causation. It's exactly the same in the Kenyans. Association doesn't prove causation. So I had this thought experiment, which is very obvious. I said, well, if it's the diet that explains why these Kenyans are so good, what are the guys who are second rate in Kenya? What are they eating? Oh, Professor Noakes, they're eating exactly the same diet. So I said, what? So how can you say it's the diet is the thing? Because your control group is your less good athletes. They're eating exactly the same diet as the good athletes. So there's no difference between the control and the good athletes. So it can't be the diet. Oh, we'd never thought of that. That's point one. And point two is that very point. No one studies the guy who's not quite so good. The guy who's a 2:06 marathoner and he has 1 or 2 good marathons and then he falls away. And they don't measure him and find, is he insulin resistant, as we've discussed? Does he have visceral obesity? Because if you are viscerally obese, if you're carrying a kilogram of extra fat and you can't see it because it's stuck away in the pancreas, you're not going to be a champion. You're not going to win the marathon. One of the best examples is another South African guy, Chris Froome, who won 4 Tour de France. When I say South African, he trained in South Africa for a period. And he was overweight by about 6 kilos. And he was good, but not a world champion. He then discovered the low-carb diet. He went on a very high-protein diet. He lost 6 kilos and won 4 Tour de France's. Now, eating the high-carb diet all the time, just made him too heavy, too much visceral fat, and he couldn't win the Tour de France. He goes on the high fat diet. I'm not suggesting he did it all the time, but he did it to control his weight. And then he wins the Tour de France 4 times and becomes a very famous cyclist. And that's what I mean. We don't study those people because we don't see them. They just drop out. That's the group you have to look at. The group that's coming second or third and not quite making it and eating the same high carb diet and maybe suffering as a consequence because they've got visceral fat, and the visceral fat's a real problem. And the only way you can get rid of visceral fat is to eat a high fat diet. You can't do it by exercise.
What happens to the retired Kenyan marathon runners? I don't know. I don't know what happens to. Maybe you know some of them.
Well, I don't want to be rude, but I met Kep Kenya, and he was no longer as lean as he was when he was running and winning Olympic gold medals. So the Kenyans are not immune to putting on weight on their diet.
Okay,
and anyway, the reason the Kenyans are so good is because they train so hard and they've got this unit and they don't believe they can lose. So until you can recreate those conditions, you're not going to beat the Kenyans.
Do you? So the other question I had was around duration of diet, adaptation, and does it vary by sport to sport?
It's a minimum of 4 weeks, and so after 4 weeks we found no difference, and 4 to 6 weeks no difference. But if you speak to athletes, they'll generally say it probably takes them longer to be fully adapted and fully happy with the diets. And one of the problems is that a lot of the negative studies were of 3 weeks, showing that the high fat diet impairs performance. They were only of 3 weeks or less. And that's the problem. But once you go beyond 4 weeks, then you find that there's no difference between the diets.
Let me ask you, again, with blood glue, this is something that I just personally anecdote. I think it was 2018, I competed in the Rowing World Championships. And I was kind of keyed in that I knew if my blood glucose was a little bit higher, I would perform better. And so knowing a little bit about human digestion, I consumed about 3 pounds of steak about 4 hours prior to the event, figuring it would take about 4 hours to get through my stomach and start hitting my bloodstream. I won the world championship, but I mean, is that a viable strategy in your mind that, because typically when we're dealing with carbohydrates, we take this gel, the sugary liquid, Gatorade 20 minutes before the performance, maybe during the performance. But if we're dealing with protein and fat and we want to optimize performance for a specific period of time, does something like that make sense to you?
Yeah, definitely to do it 4 hours before. But again, I can't see why it would make any difference to performance. That's my issue. I just don't think that what you eat immediately before or during makes a difference, except for this 10 grams in an exercise that lasts 2 hours. If it's less than 2 hours, I just don't see how it's working, except in some control system, because let's remember that to perform as you do, you have to recruit muscle. That's the key. You don't go any faster unless you recruit more muscle. And the recruitment starts up here in the brain cortex, as you know. And so that's what you have to convince yourself of. And if eating a steak 4 hours before the race can convince you they're going to recruit more muscle, then it's going to work. But biologically, in providing energy, I don't see a mechanism.
Well, I mean, obviously we need to eat though. I mean, you could just say, well, fast forever. And obviously there's going to be a point where we need to maintain the structure and all of that stuff. So, I mean, the food is obviously there for more than just fuel. Yeah. Interesting on that. As far as, this is just another observation I've made, and maybe you have some insight into this just because I know you have a broad, understanding about sports science. I found that since I started sprinting on the track, running sprints as fast as I can, hitting max velocity, or at least max velocity for me, my performance in other areas has improved. And I think it's a neurological transfer. I think my nervous system is firing more efficiently, more rapidly, and it's translating into things like rowing. I mean, does that make sense to you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Again, performance starts from the ground up. And that's what you're doing. In some way, activating the power production in your legs is going up, not because it's provided with more fuel or more oxygen, but because it's adapting in some way. Your brain's telling the muscle to work harder. And to overcome that, we don't know how you really do that. So that's what you're doing. It's a neural training mechanism that you're going through.
Yeah, that's what I've seen people talking about. Like even like sprint training translates into faster clubhead swing. It's clubhead speed when swinging a golf club, which is like okay, so it's almost a pure
Yeah.
kind of a nervous system type thing. Do you find that? What about with recovery? Do carbs impede recovery? Is that what are your thoughts around that?
No, I think it's what you spoke about. It's the inflammatory response that if you're exercising vigorously in a contact sport, you're going to be more inflamed. And the recovery, a lot of it is getting over that inflammation. And the inflammation is being driven in part by too much visceral fat. So the carbohydrates are driving the visceral fat, are driving the inflammation. I think that's the way I would explain it, or that's the way we explain it to the athletes we work with.
Carbohydrates are said to be muscle sparing or protein sparing. What are your thoughts in a low to zero carb diet with regard to protein requirements? Do they go up?
Yeah, that's a great question because a little carbohydrate, if you're fasting completely, a little carbohydrate is needed to save some of your muscle loss. That's quite correct because the protein is being turned into carbohydrate, obviously, for your brain. So if you can provide a bit of the carbohydrate, but at just 100 grams or so, is enough to stop protein loss, as far as I recall, because then you can burn your fat. The fat's not a problem. The problem in fasting is that you're turning protein into glucose, and you've only got about 7 kilos of muscle that you can convert. Once you do more than that, you're dead. And as I recall, there's something like 100 grams a day of protein that's converted to glucose when you're fasting, when you start. But then as soon as you go into ketosis and so on, you can cut that right down to literally 10 grams or something like that a day. So you don't need much carbohydrate to prevent muscle loss in fasting. And then, so all of weight loss would come from the fat loss.
What about in absence, just normally eating, not fasting, but I mean, would consuming more protein in lieu of carbohydrates serve the same purpose if you're eating regularly?
Yeah, because remember now your glucose requirement is so small that you would turn a tiny amount of protein into glucose, so that it wouldn't be a problem. You just restock that protein from what you're eating. And I mean, it would be like 10 grams a day. That's all you need. And your protein intake would be much more than that.
Yeah, certainly. I'm probably close to around 350 grams a day, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so I don't think I'm protein deficient by any means. Well, Professor Noakes, we've gone through an hour. I want to be respectful of your time. I know you got a lot of things going on, busy. It's late down there. And are you in Cape Town? I think Cape Town.
Yes. Yes.
Beautiful city, by the way. I think it's
Thank you.
a gorgeous place. Any final thoughts before we wrap this one up?
Well, I just want to compliment you on what you've done, and also being number one on that list, the EAT Lancet diet list, as misinformers. And I loved your T-shirt with misinformer on it. It's really interesting because I know that you spend a lot of money doing this sort of work, promoting this, as we all do, and we don't get paid for it. But the first claim these people made is that we're on some sort of group who's funded by the meat industry, and we're spreading all this misinformation. That's absolutely Orwellian, because the people who are claiming it are the ones who are taking the money from industry. And it's astonishing how they get away with it and tarnish us with this brush of stealing the money from industry and presenting this. Because I know all of us, all those 20 names that you mentioned, we all spend a lot of money to get this message out. I personally went to trial, as you know, and that cost a fortune. because I knew it was important that I defended the case for myself, but also for the movement. The meat industry didn't pay for that. The cereal industry didn't pay for that. And in fact, the cereal industry paid for the opposition to the prosecution indirectly. So I think I'm very proud that you stood up, you continue to stand up, and you can't be deflected from your task. So thank you very much for being an example for all of us.
Well,
And for
likewise.
having no fear in doing what you do and just pushing it, eating as you do, and showing that eating 300 grams of protein a day makes you really very, very healthy and seemingly ageless.
Well, likewise, Professor Noakes, thanks for what all you do and for leading the way and doing this for many, many decades. I mean, you're obviously an authority on so many topics. And yeah, I mean, it is interesting that, yeah, the meat industry has not paid me anything over there. They should, I think, but they haven't. Likewise for you. Hopefully, and I think at the end, good will triumph over evil. And I think we are on the side of truth. And that's what fuels us more than anything. And obviously, as a physician, I just see so many people whose lives are just utterly transformed for the better by the message that we've all shared, and we're all still learning. I mean, obviously, you said you're still doing research, and we're trying to figure out what's going on here. But it's a fun journey. It's fun to be on this fight, and I hope you continue and produce lots and lots more, hundreds more papers, and we get to learn more. And it's always a pleasure talking to you, Professor Noakes.
Thanks so much, Shawn. Been a great privilege. And again, thank you. And I must add one last point, that I really appreciate you using the carnivore diet for autoimmune diseases. I think that that's really, really interesting area, because those are terrible diseases. And again, like diabetes, they're said to be untreatable. And then you put people on all this very expensive and difficult medication. And you've had such success prescribing that for many people, and publicizing it is terribly important.
Yeah, for sure. I think, particularly things like IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, it should be the first line therapy no matter what. Hopefully we'll get that in. I know we're working on getting some intervention trials done on this stuff. So hopefully, but it takes time, takes money, hard to get it funded, but we're getting there. We're getting there. So thank you so much, Professor Noakes. Have a wonderful evening down there in wonderful Cape Town. I'm sure we'll talk again. Take care.
Thanks, Shawn. Lovely to chat to you. Stay well and row hard.
I will. Bye-bye now.